I'd like to thank my co-authors on this project, Brian Kaloji. He is the one who brought together all of the different entities and has had a major input in terms of time and effort and resources. Also Bruce Kimball and Bromjet Desange. There have been a lot of face experiments conducted over the last 3+ decades. Most of them, they were looking at plant response to the increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And jumping ahead a few years, 200 plus parts per million above ambient. They looked at a number of different field crops, looked at trees. They even used some containment facilities to do a couple of things. One, reduce the cost of CO2, also to manipulate the temperature in these experiments, as both temperature and CO2 levels are projected to continue to increase. Another co-author, Bruce Kimball, did a review paper of a number of face experiments, and across all of these there has been an increased yield. It varies according to plant species and also other factors, namely water and fertility. Is there ample nitrogen, ample water available for the plants? But generally across all of them, an increase in yield. At the same time, they noticed that there is a decrease in water use. Again, it varies according to plant species, but generally there is a reduced water use in CO2 elevated atmosphere. This information has been used for greenhouse growers, where they have enriched the atmosphere up to 1,000 parts per million carbon dioxide. They've done this either with compressed gas or, depending on the time of the year if they're needing heat, using natural gas or propane fire heaters to heat the greenhouse and also supply additional carbon dioxide in there. These have been economically viable because the cost of CO2 is less than the increased yield, and it's possible because it's a contained facility. But how do we commercialize this to other agricultural operations out in the atmosphere of hundreds and thousands of acres? Well, if we go to the source of the CO2 generators to get it at low or no cost, then it becomes a viable option. And in my view, the long-term success of this is if the CO2 producer gets credit from the Air Resources Board or whatever other entity is issuing permits for carbon sequestration. I met with another CO2 producer here recently, and in order to maintain their permit, they are having to look at deep underground injection of the CO2 that they generate, a very costly process. So they are very interested in being able to get credit for CO2 sequestration in a permanent crop. California Department of Agriculture also has their State Water Efficiency and Enhancement Program, or SWEEP, providing financial assistance to growers to implement irrigation systems that reduce greenhouse gases and save water. Both of those can be accomplished with CO2 enhancement. So Brian Kaloji, as part of this project, went out and got commitment from a refinery to supply CO2 to an orchard, which happened to be across the street, the Desange brothers' orchard. And they committed to having this project conducted in their field. One of the stacks at the refinery that burns natural gas generates 50,000 plus megagrams of CO2 a year, and they committed to supplying that for this project. So Brian, on behalf of Desange Brothers, submitted a grant application to CDFA, to the SWEEP program, for the CO2 enrichment on 20 acres of the orchard, a massive undertaking, and received the grant. As that was in the spring of this year, and as these things were coming together, that's when the challenges and obstacles started to appear. For the refinery, getting permits to alter their stack was something that would take a bit of time and effort, but not unreasonable. But what they did have an issue with was the investment dollars up front. The couple $100,000 it would take to modify the stack and deliver the CO2. They were hesitant to commit to that unless the grower was agreed to buying CO2 from them over the next 10 years so they could recoup their investment dollars. The grower, on the other hand, is resistant to committing to buying CO2 for 10 years because we haven't shown that in a commercial setting the CO2 enrichment is going to get the yield increase that he needs to offset the cost. The face experiments that have been conducted, none of them have been on almonds specifically, and also do the results that we see in a well-managed research plot transfer in the same way to a large-scale orchard. Those were the challenges. CDFA also was hesitant to release any of the money until we were able to do proof of concept. So the large project of 20 acres of CO2 enrichment was drastically scaled down, and with a limited budget we needed to show proof of concept before any of these entities agreed to the larger project. So the first thing we needed to show was that we could deliver to a commercial orchard flue gas and mimic the concentrations that are in the flue gas. One of the considerations in the type of fuel that is burned are what other contaminants may be in the flue gas, ethylene being of prime importance. It would defoliate the orchard very quickly if there were ethylene in the flue gas. So using a propane-powered generator, because we also needed power to run the fans, and a gasoline-powered engine, collecting the exhaust from those two and delivering it into the orchard, we were able to mimic the CO2 concentration that we would get out of the refinery stack. That was the first part. The next part was to show that we could reduce the gas temperature from 400 plus Celsius down to something close to ambient as it's released into the field. We could do that a couple ways. One would be with radiative heat loss through the long distribution pipe. No, we didn't have the long distribution pipe, so we were going to the next option, which is a quench column. We're introducing the hot exhaust gas here at the bottom end of the column, up, over, and down the other column, and there is water misted into the column to reduce the temperature. Before I show any of the data, I'll show you how we were collecting it. We have NIR CO2 sensors that are housed inside a radiation shield that are placed at either 3 meters or 5 meters in between trees. The trees are planted approximately 6 meters apart, and then gas is released at the base of each tree into the inside of the tree. So the first thing we're looking at is mimicking the flue gas out of the factory at somewhere between 5 and 10,000 parts per million, and we were able to do that with the combined exhaust gas from the generator and from another engine. We're also able to significantly reduce the temperature of the exhaust gas with the quench column. There's a little bit more refining we need to do with length of time that the gas is passing through the quench column on that, but we're able to reduce it down to something that's manageable as it's injected into the orchard. And we see the humidity spikes with the gas as it's going through the quench column. In arranging for the large distribution, there is a single outlet at each tree. We did a lot of difference playing with the diameter of the vent and also the height of the vent. We also did a little bit of playing with the air velocity moving through the system, and it ranged from 300 CFM to 1,000 CFM. We're trying to hone in on the best methodology for delivering the CO2 so we get a uniform distribution around the tree. This is one of the days that we ran the system. We see this is the CO2 concentration measured right above the vent, and we need to be a little more consistent in what we're delivering, and we get the best results when we're upwards to the 10,000 parts per million reading on there, which is within the range of what we would see out of the refinery flue gas stack. When we have that higher concentration in our delivery, then we see higher peaks, and we're able to get it to the level that is desired out in the orchard. Again, we need to be more consistent on the delivery. CDFA is very interested in the conservation of water in this project, so we will be monitoring the soil moisture also. The trees are irrigated with micro sprinklers. There are 2 sprinklers for each tree, and they wet an approximately a 4-meter diameter area on each side of the tree. The trees are irrigated often, approximately every 5 days, and so we see up and down in the surface 30 centimeters the refilling of the profile and water use in that cycle. Hopefully in a year we'll be able to have more data on a bigger scale to talk about, and that we'll be able to talk about it in person with you. I am very interested in your questions because I know that you will have a lot of them, and it will help us hone in and focus a little bit differently on how to successfully deliver CO2 to a large commercial orchard. Subsequent to the due date for the American Society of Agronomy virtual meeting, we were able to take some additional measurements of CO2 in the orchard. We added more CO2 sensors, so they are at 10 feet and 15 feet and at multiple locations around a central tree and including some in the tree. We're also measuring the CO2 coming right out of the vent. So on this day, we're measuring CO2 and injecting more into the orchard. You can see here, this is the CO2 coming out of the vent and corresponding levels here in the orchard. These particular ones are taken in between the trees. We can see lots of ups and downs recorded each minute. When we did a 10-minute average, we see a lot more consistency in the numbers. We see higher levels at higher CO2 levels at 10 feet than at 15 feet, but more consistency across time. And then when we try and look at all of the sensors together, and if you can envision that the tree is in this position with the sensors all around and the CO2 levels that it represents, so the tree is in the center of this part. You see, for a great period of time that we were doing this, we were able to maintain between 600 and 700 parts per million completely surrounding the tree at the 10-foot level, at the perimeter of the tree where most of the leaves are. There was a slight dip here, and occasionally we got a little higher, even higher. We didn't see quite the levels at the 15 feet. That's the top of the canopy of the trees. But we were able to maintain CO2 completely around the perimeter and in the center of the tree during this time period.